Mikhalia, you've had periods in your life as a family where your dad has probably feared he may lose you. You feared you may lose your dad, and you both may have feared that you would lose your mum, Mikhalia, and Jordan, your wife. I mean, you've had some extraordinary things to deal with as a family. How have you dealt with that?
Have you dealt with that?
I don't have PTSD anymore, so I think I've dealt with that. How did we deal with that?
We communicated.
Jeez. We communicated a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And prayed at the end when it got really tough.
So that's interesting.
We tried to find our way through. I told Mikhalia when she was a little kid, I told her at one point when she got really sick, I said, we had a very serious conversation. She wasn't a very old girl. I said, look, kid, you're going to have a very hard life. It's going to be brutal. And this is after we knew she had the worst case of arthritis that the Toronto Sick Kids hospital had ever seen. That's not a diagnosis you want to hear from a hospital, not a big hospital. Like, your child has the worst case of this illness we've ever seen. It's like, what's her prognosis? Multiple early joint replacements. So that's like painful degeneration followed by early death. Oh yeah, that's not so good. Well, so what's worse than that? Well, what's worse than that is adopting the role of victim, becoming resentful, and turning against life, because then you get to have multiple early collapsed joints followed by death, and you get to be ultimately miserable and in hell at the same time. So I sat her down and I said, look, kid, don't ever use your illness as an excuse. Like, it's going to be difficult for you to do things, difficult for you to get up in the morning to go to school. It's going to be painful. And it's even going to be hard for you to tell when you can do something and when you can't, when you're justified in saying, look, Dad, I just can't get out of bed. I said, don't fool yourself about your illness, because then you won't be able to distinguish what you can do from what you can't do, and then you will truly be lost. And she listened. You know, I don't think you were more than about 9 or 10 when we had that conversation. She listened. Yeah. I had a conversation with my son at about the same time. You know, and I said, look, kid, your sister is very sick and we're screwed. And the probability that I'm going to be able to pay sufficient attention to you for the next few years is like 0. You're going to have to, like, face this, and you're going to have to grow up and take this on yourself. And you cannot be any trouble, because we've got enough trouble. Any more, it's going to sink us. And so he listened, and he was no trouble. I mean, how was Julian with you when you were at home?
Good. Very good. Compassionate for somebody who's fairly disagreeable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he stuck around. He was at home. I mean, he had lots of friends, and he did his teenage things, but he came home and he helped, and he was no trouble.
Mikhalia, the way your dad talked that, it could be taken as being tough love, or it could be just a reality check of, look, you can either spend the next few years of your life feeling sorry for yourself, or you can crack on with life and make the best of it, which is exactly the advice I would have given one of my children in that position. But how did you feel at the time you were given it?
Well, I think I remember that, and I think I was in grade 2. So I would have been 7 or 8. I was pretty little. So I didn't even, like, at that time, I didn't even understand what arthritis was. I thought, oh, great, I have an old person disease. That's as much as I understood, and I didn't want to tell anybody about it because it was an old person disease. And so I don't even think I had second thoughts about anything Dad said because I was so young. I just figured, okay, that's my dad, that's what he says I should do, then I'll do it. I don't think I thought anything more than that. But I do think that was instrumental in getting out of chronic illness, honestly.
Yeah, because you barely got out of it. If you would have complicated it up with some additional stupidity, some resentment, well, I think that's probably true in our family in general. I mean, we didn't do things perfectly, but we did our best not to be resentful, and resentment is really a killer. I think if you would have burdened yourself with victimized resentment, you wouldn't have made it.
Yeah, you know what I did rather than become resentful? And I don't know if this was a healthy thing to do, but I got really angry. Mm-hmm. I didn't get angry at anybody per se. I got angry in a, it wasn't feeling sorry for myself, but it was, what am I going to do to get out of this?
That's
like, how dare
man.
Life do this to me? Mm-hmm. That's not who I am.
Yep.
So I was angry for a long time.
Yeah, well, that's part of, you know, one of the things you want to do is you want to get your anger on your side. You want to put it inside instead of facing you and stopping you. You want to use it as a force that drives you forward. And you definitely did that. You were a pretty implacable person.
You didn't waste time and energy trying to rationalize this or explain why you'd been singled out. It was just a case of it's happened, we've got to deal with it.
Well, I went to Jerusalem with a friend of mine, Jonathan Pageau, and Pageau's a very brilliant man. And we walked the Via Dolorosa, which is the route of Christ's Passion with its 12 stations. And each station is a kind of, is a microcosm of suffering. And then, of course, the entire journey culminates in the most unjust suffering imaginable. And that's what the story is. The Christian Passion is the story of the most unjust suffering imaginable. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with you? And the answer is, that's going to happen to you. There's going to be unjust suffering in your life. And you're called upon to radically embrace that and to say yes. And that's even the case if it's your children who are called upon to make the sacrifice. And that's the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. God calls on Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And, that seems like a bit much, but you have to offer your children to the world. You have to offer your children to be destroyed by the world. You have to say yes to that radically, full-heartedly. And the more you do that, weirdly, paradoxically, the more you do both of those, accept that for yourself, accept that for your children, welcome it, the less catastrophic this sacrifice has to be. It's so paradoxical. Well, you think about it, if you protect your children unduly, you weaken them. If you let them encounter the world and the micro tragedies that go along with that encounter, let's say, they get strong.
Yeah.
And there's no limit to that. There's no upper end. And so that's why in the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, you're enjoined to take up your cross and bear it and to walk uphill nonetheless. And the reason for that is there is no better alternative. Of course, you have to say yes to life. And that means saying yes to some pretty brutal realities.
What your dad was just talking about. But you've been through that yourself, that process. But you also then had to flip it round. When 3.5 years ago, your dad was very seriously ill, in a medically induced coma in a clinic in Russia. You were at his side throughout that process. What were you thinking with the situation reversed?
And you were dealing with the Russian mafia.
Yeah.
Well, what was that? What was that like for you, Mikhalia?
Oh, I cannot even describe how horrible it was. Like, I thought being sick myself was bad because it was very bad. I thought getting off of antidepressants, I went through antidepressant withdrawal, which was just horrifying beyond belief. I thought that was bad. Watching how sick my dad got was so much worse than what I went through that it was hard not to, what did I think? I literally, you know what, for some reason, when he got really sick, I thought I could just move to LA. I was in Toronto and I thought I could just move to LA. We didn't know what was wrong with him. He'd been to a number of different hospitals and my mom had been sick and I thought I could just move to LA and I could do things by myself and I don't have to deal with this. And then I thought about it and I had this weird feeling that whatever was wrong with him, which I thought was antidepressant withdrawal, which is what had happened to me, would last about 2 years. So I sat down and I decided, okay, I'm going to do whatever I can to help this guy. And I think it's going to be absolute hell for a couple of years. And I don't know why I had that feeling, but I had this feeling of this 2-year period. And so I decided rather than running away, which had definitely crossed my mind, I'd do everything I possibly could and just put my life on hold until he got better, which I figured was about 2 years. So while this was happening, particularly when we were in Russia, I was like, at that point, I was literally learning Russian. I was like, I don't know how long we're gonna be here. Russian is not easy to learn. But I was like, I made a commitment, I'm gonna help and see this through, and I believe that he can get better. So I think the way I managed that was I had a really strong belief that he's sick, but he can get better, and I just have to stick with him till he gets better. And nobody could change my mind from that, not even him, even though he tried. It's like, I'm not going to make it. Like, yeah, you are. You're going to be fine. We just got to get through this. So I think that's what helped, was a naive optimism of getting better.
I mean, it's fascinating.
Faith.
Fascinating to see the roles reversed there, Jordan, but then you both had to deal with your wife getting very sick with cancer, your mum, Mikhalia, and you both had to deal with that. After given what you'd both been through, what was that like for you as a unit, the pair of you, and of course, Julian too?
Well, it was remarkable to see her deal with that, really, to see Tammy deal with that, because Tammy's a very, very tough person. And even she got the news initially that she had a form of cancer that was 100% fatal in 11 months and that no treatment, there was no evidence whatsoever that any treatment, radiologic, chemotherapeutic, or surgical, would help. So that we all got that dumped on us in about 10 minutes. And she just took that in and went on walking. And in fact, I think she was not really even overwhelmingly affected by that until she had to tell Julian and saw that reflected in him. And that really changed her, because she saw that that made more of a difference to him than it did even to her. And so she saw the love she had granted him, because she was an excellent mother, reflected. And that really changed her life. It might have saved her life, but it certainly transformed her permanently. And that took a long time to unfold. But she's one tough cookie, and she took everything on the chin. And Tammy basically was at the edge of death for 3 months every day. She just about starved to death during the recovery process from her surgery because of a surgical complication. She lost about almost 30% of her body weight, and she did suffer a little bit with post-starvation syndrome as a consequence of that. But I don't think I ever saw Tammy desperate or resentful during that whole time.
No.
And she opened herself up. She accepted help where she could get it. She took every possibility to move forward that was offered to her. She opened herself up to transformation on every front and really did change. And I would say she's now doing better than she ever has in her life. It's really quite miraculous to see, apart from the fact that she also recovered. And as far as we know, she's the only person who ever survived this form of cancer.
Incredible.
She said, she credits it, I think this is worth mentioning, it was the weirdest thing. So she got really sick. It was horrible. I wasn't around as much when she got sick because I had PTSD from my hospital experiences, and I didn't want to go into a hospital. I went to the hospitals, but like the PTSD was pretty bad. And she was stuck in the hospital, and she said, I'm going to get better. This is just such a strange story. She said, I'm going to get better on our anniversary, which for mom and dad is mid-August. And this was June. And she told everybody this, and we're like, okay, mom, like she's on morphine. We're like, not sure what's going on. And then they flew to the US to do a procedure, which didn't work. And then on their anniversary, she got better, which was really weird because nobody was expecting that. And she goes, oh, it was God, and converted to Catholicism.
Wow.
And so that made the entire period even more surreal because
what
it didn't make any sense. Yeah.
It was our 30th anniversary. Yeah.
So Jordan, I would ask you,
all the surgical complications stopped on our anniversary.
I mean, that is miraculous, and it brings me back to what I asked you when it was just me and you talking, which is whether you believe in God. What happened to your wife, to Tammy, and her turning to God in that moment? Did that not give you all the proof you needed that there is a God?
Well, I was already very religiously inclined before that. I mean, I've been studying religious thinking for 40 years, and speaking to my students about that very diligently during that whole time. And so in some ways, I mean, the anniversary issue, that was very strange.
Yeah.
And the transformations that have occurred in relationship to Tammy are quite profound and wonderful and hard to believe. Was that additional evidence to me? I already had a lot of evidence. what we talked about in other. I was already a firm believer in hell, and I knew there was a route away from hell, and the route away from hell is a religious pathway. So I've been walking down that pathway a very, very long time. So this was just another, not just, you know what I mean? It's a milestone and a marker, but it wasn't, for me, that wasn't a qualitative transformation.
Did you dodge the God question in the previous interview?
Well,
He did.
I wouldn't say so.
Michaela. He did. And it was really,
I knew it.
It was really interesting. And in fact, it's almost like he's almost rewinding now, because if I'd asked him right now, I may have got a different answer. Because I think, Jordan, I think you do believe in God, and I think what's happened to your family has reinforced that belief. But for some reason, you're reticent to just say it.
Modern people don't understand this question. They think that it's a matter of believing in a set of facts. It's not. If you believe in God, you allow the spirit of the Logos to take residence within you. Now, but nobody understands what you mean if you say that. But think about it this way. Mikhalia could have got bitter and resentful. Well, the spirit of bitter resentment is the spirit of Cain, because her sacrifices would have gone unrewarded. She would have been rejected by God, and she would have shaken her fist at the sky. And the spirit of Cain is a Luciferian spirit, and it's a genocidal spirit. And you can allow that spirit to take up its residence within you. And that means that you're a follower of the Luciferian spirit. Or you can do the opposite. You can allow the spirit of the Logos to take residence within you. And that's what you're attempting to do if you adhere assiduously to a genuine religious practice.
Okay, Mikhalia.
And that's real.
All right,
it's real.
Let me ask Mikhalia. I mean, you said to me, did he dodge the question on God? Why did you say that?
Just to see what his face would look like if I said that while he was on Piers Morgan.
And his body language. The arms went up very quickly, I noticed. Quite defensive body language, Mr. Psychologist.
You gave her a chance to be annoying. She immediately took it.
Well, Mikhalia, explain why did you ask him about God? You asked me why.
Well, I believe in God.
Yeah.
And I didn't before. Or I wasn't sure before. I was never an atheist. But, when people would say, do you believe in God? I'd say, I don't know. I don't really get it. I'd like to. I always wanted to. And so when Mom converted to Catholicism, and I saw, a whole bunch of really weird things that I couldn't logic out happened, let alone Dad becoming famous and then us all getting so sick and an unbelievable amount of suffering, and then Mom's miraculous recovery that she knew ahead of time by 2 months, the date of, that nobody could explain.
Yeah, well, you learned at least that you had no idea how the world worked.
Oh, absolutely none. That's what I learned, is I don't understand what's going on at all. But I saw the transformation that took place in Mom, and I saw how much more compassionate she became, because she's a very disagreeable woman, and I wouldn't say compassion is one of her strong suits. And she became more compassionate somewhat dramatically. And then
she's trying to love everybody in the world now. It's very annoying.
Yeah, it's nice. And so that was enough for, that wasn't quite enough for me, actually. It was about a year later, and Dad was so sick, and I didn't know, I had exhausted everything I knew how to do to help. I couldn't think of any other way I could help. And I remember praying at that point, because I literally couldn't think of anything else to do. I was just like, God, help us, help me. And I think it was around that period where something switched, and then my life got easier. And I don't know if that's because I let go of some control that I don't actually have, but my life switched directions, and I felt calmer in a way that I couldn't describe or come to any, I couldn't figure out why, and I figured that was God. So that was enough for me to say, reality isn't exactly how we see it. There's more going on out there. And
Mikhalia, if I asked you, Mikhalia, do you think your dad believes in God? What would you say?
Get it right.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I do too.
He definitely, I think so. He definitely lives in a way where he knows that if he acts as if he believes in God, then he avoids hell. So I don't know what the difference
That's a good
between
deal.
that
Yeah.
and belief is. Why would you do that if you didn't believe? Right?
Right,
Seems
George?
reasonable to me.
Right, George?